My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 31 years old, born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, and until a week after my wedding, I thought I understood the language of loyalty. I thought I knew the rules that bound family and love together, that invisible thread of trust you don't question because it's been woven into your life since birth. I wasn't naive. At least, I didn't think I was. I'd seen enough of life to know that people lied, cheated, and betrayed, but I always believed that those who shared your blood or your bed were exceptions to the rule. That belief shattered the moment I came home early on a Thursday afternoon, still wearing my navy blue blazer from work, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor, and found the bedroom door of my own home half open, the sound of muffled laughter leaking through like poison under a doorframe. I remember the smell first, his cologne, the one I had given him as a wedding gift, heavier than usual, mingled with a floral perfume I knew by heart. Not because I wore it, but because my sister did. Emily, my younger sister by 4 years, with the kind of beauty that seemed to excuse her worst behavior. Growing up, people used to say she could talk her way out of anything, and she often did. Even as kids, she had a talent for taking what she wanted and leaving someone else to clean up the mess. But I'd never imagined she'd take this. Not him. Not my husband. Not the man I had just stood beside in front of family and friends, promising to build a life together. I froze in the hallway, my palm pressed against the cool wall as my breath slowed to a silent crawl. The voices were clearer now, her soft giggle, his lower, deeper murmur. Then the sound of sheets shifting, the unmistakable rhythm of intimacy. My stomach dropped into some hollow place I didn't know existed, and for a long moment, I stood there suspended between the urge to burst in and the instinct to disappear. I chose the latter, not out of weakness, but because in that moment, I understood something. Silence could be sharper than any scream. Silence could cut cleaner than rage. I stepped back, heel by heel, retracing my steps down the hallway. My mind wasn't screaming, it was already working. A cold, precise inventory of facts, 1 week after the wedding. The marriage license signed, the joint accounts open, the will he'd pushed me to update already filed, the keys to everything in my purse. My exit, if I took it now, would be invisible. They'd never know I'd been there. And that invisibility, I realized, was power. They wouldn't get a confrontation. They'd get a dismantling. Piece by piece, inch by inch, until everything they thought was theirs slipped like sand through their fingers. I walked out the front door without closing it too hard, my heels crunching on the gravel driveway. The late afternoon air was crisp, but it didn't sting the way I expected. I think that was the first sign of the person I was becoming, not the wife betrayed, but the architect of their undoing. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't even feel my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I drove to the edge of town, parked in a lot overlooking the water, and sat there, watching the tide drag itself in and out, timing my breaths with its pull. By the time the sky turned the color of wet slate, I had the beginning of a plan. It wasn't just about revenge. That word feels too blunt, too crude for what I envisioned. This would be a dismantling, a careful unspooling of the life they thought they were building at my expense. It would happen in steps, quiet ones at first, precise enough to seem like coincidence, then sharper, more public, until there was nothing left of their comfort, their security, their smug sense of control. I wanted them to live in the shadow of what they'd done, to feel the ground shift under them without ever seeing the fault line. That night, I didn't go back home. I booked a hotel room under my maiden name, using the emergency credit card I kept for situations I'd once thought of as unlikely: car accidents, medical emergencies, the occasional storm that cut power for days. This wasn't the kind of emergency I'd imagined, but it was the one I had. I ordered room service, not because I was hungry, but because I wanted to sit across from a plate of untouched food and rehearse the calm I would need. My phone lit up with texts from him, around 9 innocuous ones, asking when I'd be home, followed by a photo of wine glasses on the kitchen counter, like he was setting the stage for romance. I didn't answer. Instead, I pulled out a notebook from my bag and began listing assets, accounts, properties, joint investments, shared passwords I knew by heart. I mapped them in a branching diagram, marking what was mine outright and what I could reclaim with the right paperwork. Then, another list: her weaknesses, Emily's debts, her tendency to overspend, the string of boyfriends she'd cycled through, some of whom I still knew well enough to call. Her habit of keeping screenshots and messages in cloud folders she never bothered to secure. The work calmed me. It turned my fury into something that could be measured and executed. By midnight, I'd closed the notebook with the first 3 steps in place. Step 1 would be the smallest cut, so small he wouldn't notice at first, but deep enough to draw blood when it mattered. The kind of move that would make him stumble without realizing I was the one who'd set the trap. When I finally lay back in the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, I thought about the door that had been half open, the sound of their laughter spilling into the hallway. I realized then that I would never forget that moment, not because of the pain it caused, but because it had given me something rarer, something cleaner than outrage. It had given me clarity, and clarity, once you have it, is a blade you don't put down. I drifted to sleep with a strange, steady thought repeating in my head. They had taken something from me, yes, but they had also handed me the blueprint for their destruction. And starting tomorrow, I would begin to build it. The morning after my night at the hotel, I woke up before sunrise, the city still wrapped in that soft, bluish light that makes everything seem almost harmless. My mind was anything but. The plan from the night before had settled into something sharper, more urgent. Step 1. The money. Not all of it, at least, not yet. That would be too obvious, too sudden, the kind of thing that forces someone into panic mode before you've had a chance to enjoy the build-up. No. I wanted the first cut to bleed slowly. I wanted him to think he was still in control while I was already draining the lifeblood from his comfort. The joint account was our biggest asset together, the one we had opened months before the wedding under the guise of building our future. It was where my salary went, where he'd deposited part of his, and where the wedding gifts from friends and family had landed. He thought of it as ours, but I knew exactly how to make it mine without triggering alarms, at least, not immediately. I started by logging in from the hotel Wi-Fi, my fingers flying across the keyboard with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this in their mind a dozen times. I moved a significant chunk into an account under my maiden name, one he didn't even know existed, a private fortress I had kept for years in case life ever decided to remind me it could be cruel. I left enough behind to keep the illusion alive, just enough for his next few expenses to go through without suspicion. It was a surgical strike, and I took my time, double-checking every detail before logging out. By 8 o'clock, I was dressed in the same navy blazer from yesterday, hair tied back, calm as glass. I checked out of the hotel and drove straight to the bank, not ours, but mine. The teller greeted me like an old friend. I had been coming here for years. I deposited the transferred funds in person, signed every paper with a steady hand, and when she asked if I wanted to update the security protocols on the account, I smiled and said, yes. Maximum restrictions. It felt like bolting the doors on a house they didn't even know I owned. When I finally walked back into my house later that morning, the first thing I noticed was how ordinary everything looked. The wine glasses from the photo he'd sent were still on the counter, half full. The bed had been made with suspicious precision. It was the kind of staging you do when you want to erase traces, but I knew better. He was still asleep, sprawled across the bed like someone who believed the world was his to command. I didn't wake him. I simply went into the closet, retrieved a small lockbox from the top shelf, and removed the last few documents linking me to certain shared obligations, old insurance forms, a joint credit card agreement, anything that could give him leverage later. These went straight into my tote bag. At lunch, he called me, his voice thick with fake warmth, asking how my morning had been. I told him I'd just been running errands. He didn't need to know the kind of errands I'd run. That afternoon, I watched from my home office as he left the house in his favorite leather jacket, the one I'd bought him for his birthday, heading off to whatever lies he told himself. That was the beauty of it, he still believed the performance. The first ripple came 3 days later. I heard it in his voice when he tried to pay for something over the phone, and the tone shifted from casual to annoyed. A small purchase, but the card had declined. He brushed it off with the operator, blaming a technical glitch, but I could hear the edge under his words. That was the moment I knew the knife had touched the skin. Not deep enough to make him bleed out yet, but enough for him to start checking for wounds. And while he checked, I would keep cutting. I didn't rush it. I let him stew for another week, making small withdrawals until the account was light enough that the next blow would land hard. I wanted him to feel the panic slowly rising, the questions forming. And when he finally came to me, puzzled, maybe even suspicious, I would already be on to the next step. Because this wasn't about just taking the money, it was about taking the ground from under his feet, one quiet inch at a time, until there was nothing left for him to stand on. The safe he thought was ours was now mine, and he didn't even know it had been opened. I didn't go looking for dirt on her at first. The irony is that she had already buried herself under a mountain of it long before I ever decided to start digging. My sister Amelia always had a way of presenting herself as the golden one, the one who didn't need to chase attention because it supposedly chased her. The truth was uglier. She thrived on chaos, the kind that bloomed in whispers and broken promises. And now, after seeing her in my bed with the man who had sworn vows to me just a week before, I understood that the best way to hit her wasn't with a single blow, it was to make her choke on her own reflection. The first breadcrumb appeared the night after I emptied the joint account. I couldn't sleep, so I opened my laptop and began scrolling through old family photos, social media posts, anything that might sting if brought back into the light. That's when I remembered something from 3 years earlier, an argument she'd had with our cousin at a barbecue. He'd accused her of ruining 2 marriages and owing someone money. At the time, I brushed it off as one of his drunken outbursts, but now it was a starting point. I messaged him at a no pleasantries. Tell me everything you know about Amelia's debts. He replied almost instantly, like he'd been waiting years for someone to ask. In the next hour, he sent me screenshots, forwarded emails, and even a copy of a police report from a neighboring county about a domestic dispute involving her and a man she'd been seeing while he was still married. Apparently, Amelia had a pattern of sliding into relationships like a shadow, never fully seen until it was too late, leaving behind unpaid bills, maxed out credit cards, and the wreckage of trust. But the real prize came in the form of a PDF, a loan agreement for $42,000 she had taken from a private lender notorious for aggressive collection tactics. According to the cousin, she'd defaulted on it, and the lender had been quietly circling, too wary to go after her publicly because of her connections in a certain social circle. I knew right then that this was my lever. For the next week, I became an archivist of her sins. I reached out to 2 of her former roommates, both of whom had stories that could rot her perfect girl image in seconds. One told me about the time Amelia stole rent money and blamed it on a bank error. The other had receipts, literally dozens of Venmo and PayPal transactions that painted a clear picture of someone borrowing constantly and repaying almost never. And then there were the romantic entanglements. 3 affairs in as many years, each one overlapping just enough to cause maximum damage if laid out in a neat timeline. By the time I was done, I had a folder so damning it could have doubled as an obituary for her social life. But I didn't just want revenge. I wanted theater. So I set the stage. On a quiet Tuesday morning, I created a brand new email account with no TIs to me and named it the Truth Committee. I wrote a single, cold paragraph. This is what Amelia Carter doesn't want you to know. The attached documents are a public service. Draw your own conclusions. No threats, no accusations, just an invitation to look. Attached was a meticulously organized zip file, finances, affairs, legal issues, statements from sources. Each file was labeled with dates and brief descriptions, so anyone could navigate her history like chapters in a book. Then I hit send. Not to 1 or 2 people, but to everyone in our family group chat, her closest friends, her boss, and most importantly, the extended social circle she prided herself on impressing. I even included a few key members of her country club, knowing gossip there spread faster than wildfire in July. The fallout was instant. My phone began vibrating with message after message, half in disbelief, half in delight. Screenshots of the email started circulating online, jumping from private threads to public posts. By the afternoon, I heard from my cousin again. Amelia had shut down her social media accounts and was handling a crisis. She didn't know where it had come from yet, but that was fine. The beauty of precision work is that it leaves no fingerprints. When I saw her in person 3 days later, pure coincidence, at a coffee shop near my office, she looked smaller somehow, like the air had been drained from her. Her eyes flicked to me for just a moment, and I could tell she suspected something, but she couldn't prove it, and that was the point. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was loaded. I sipped my coffee and let her stew in the fact that every room she walked into now contained someone who knew at least one of her secrets. The satisfaction wasn't in watching her squirm. It was in knowing that this was just the beginning. I hadn't touched him yet, not directly, but I was laying the groundwork. Breaking her was important because she had been his ally in betrayal, and when the walls finally fell on him, I wanted her standing right next to him, with no way out. The next move would be his turn, and I already knew exactly where to strike. By the time Amelia's perfect facade was crumbling, I knew it was only a matter of days before my dear husband would start to feel the aftershocks. He wasn't the type to crumble emotionally like she did. He was calculated, guarded, the kind of man who would see a fire in the distance and assume he could walk through it without getting burned. That was exactly why my next move had to hit him where it hurt: his wallet, his reputation, and his carefully manufactured image as a man who could close any deal. If Amelia's undoing had been a slow leak, his would be a detonation. It started with a file I found buried deep in the drawer of his home office, under a stack of golf club membership forms and glossy brochures from yacht companies he could never actually afford. The file was a pristine manila folder labeled Jefferson Contract Pending Signatures. Inside, there was a non-disclosure agreement, a projected earnings sheet, and a printout of an email chain with a client named Alan Jefferson, someone I vaguely remembered meeting at a charity event months earlier. Jefferson was old money, the kind of man who didn't invest in people so much as he purchased them, molding them into whatever role he needed. My husband had been courting this man for months, promising him a lucrative partnership involving commercial properties and estates. The thing about men like my husband is that their hunger for validation often outweighs their sense of self-preservation. He couldn't just pitch Jefferson the deal honestly. No. He had to embellish. He had to inflate numbers, downplay risks, and imply connections to other investors who, in reality, barely knew his name. The lies were all laid out in that email chain like breadcrumbs leading straight to a cliff. He was scheduled to fly out to meet Jefferson the following Thursday to sign the final agreement. That gave me 6 days to turn the entire deal into dust. I didn't rush. That's the mistake people make when they're angry. They want immediate impact. But destruction that lasts is slow, deliberate, and almost invisible until it's too late. First, I pulled every email in the chain and saved them to an encrypted drive. Then, using the same burner account I'd created for Amelia's little public unmasking, I drafted a new email. This time, the tone was different: professional, clipped, and with just enough legal jargon to make it sound like it came from a whistleblower within my husband's own circle. Mr. Jefferson, before you sign anything with Mark Davis, you may want to review the attached documents. They detailed discrepancies between the projections he has given you and the actual financial standing of his operation, as well as communications suggesting misrepresentation of investor commitments. Consider this a courtesy. You have the right to know exactly who you're going into business with. Attached were the incriminating emails, side-by-side comparisons of his fabricated numbers with publicly available data. And because I wanted the blow to feel surgical, a few casual remarks he had made to a friend over text about bleeding Jefferson for every dime before he got wise, I sent it at 11:47 p.m. Knowing Jefferson was an early riser and the first thing he did each morning was check his email over black coffee. By the time my husband left for work the next day, Jefferson had already replied, not to him, of course, but to the phantom sender I had created. The reply was short: "This is troubling. I'll take it from here." The fallout began that same afternoon. My husband came home later than usual, his usual swagger noticeably dimmed. He muttered something about miscommunication and Jefferson being jumpy, but I could see the panic behind his eyes. The meeting was still scheduled, but he was already on edge. He spent the next 2 days shuffling papers, making phone calls, and even rehearsing lines in the mirror like an actor preparing for a high-stakes role. He didn't realize the stage had already been burned down. Thursday came, and I watched from the living room window as he loaded his suitcase into the back of the car, dressed in his best suit, his tie perfectly knotted. There was a false confidence in the way he drove off, like a man convincing himself the nightmare was just in his head. Later that evening, he returned. No suitcase, no tie, no jacket, just a hollow look that told me everything. Jefferson hadn't just pulled out of the deal. He had done it in the most humiliating way possible. In front of other potential investors, Jefferson had laid the documents on the table and asked, "Would you like to explain these?" My husband, cornered and without a believable lie ready, had stammered until Jefferson told him to leave. By the next morning, the whispers had started. People in his industry have a way of sniffing out weakness, and once they smell it, they circle. 2 smaller deals he'd been working on fell through by the end of the week. The man who had once bragged about being able to recover from anything was suddenly radioactive in his own professional sphere. And the best part? He still didn't know how Jefferson had gotten those files. That night, as he sat at the kitchen table nursing a glass of whiskey he couldn't afford, Amelia walked in without knocking. She looked worse than she had at the coffee shop, her phone buzzing constantly with unanswered messages. They spoke in hushed tones, clearly both aware their separate disasters were somehow linked, but neither of them dared say my name. I stood in the hallway, just out of sight, savoring the way they avoided looking at each other too long, like they were afraid of what might spill out if they did. They didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the climax. It wasn't even close. Amelia had been stripped of her shine, and now his professional veneer was cracking. My next move would cut deeper because it would take from him something he loved for no reason other than it was his, and watching it slip away would feel like a piece of himself being torn out. And when it was gone, he'd understand that every step of this was intentional. After the Jefferson contract imploded, the shift in Mark's demeanor was like watching a storm pull out to sea, still visible, still dangerous, but quieter, more measured. He moved slower, spoke less, and kept his phone closer to him than ever before, as if every incoming message could be another piece of his world collapsing. The thing about Mark, though, was that even in the middle of a personal disaster, he clung to symbols of control. His car, an obsidian black Aston Martin DB11, was the crown jewel of those symbols. It wasn't just a vehicle to him. It was his moving shrine, a rolling altar to the image he wanted the world to worship. The day he bought it, he had paraded me to the dealership under the pretense of helping him choose, though the contract was already signed and the salesman already knew my name as the primary owner. That was the first time I realized just how casually he put expensive things in my name, convincing himself it was for convenience while in reality, it was because he couldn't qualify for them alone. After the Jefferson humiliation, that car became his refuge. I noticed he started polishing it every Saturday morning, alone in the driveway, as if the gleam on its hood could reflect back a man who wasn't falling apart. He would take it for long drives with no destination, and every time he returned, there was a little less light in his eyes, like the road hadn't been able to erase what he'd lost. That car wasn't just a possession, it was the last thread holding his ego together, which made it the perfect next target. I started by pulling the purchase records from the dealership, which confirmed what I already knew. My name was on every single piece of paperwork, from the financing agreement to the insurance policy. The payments were being withdrawn from our now defunct joint account, which meant I was well within my rights to decide where the vehicle ultimately ended up. All I needed was a reason to make it disappear without it looking like a theft. That reason came when I reached out to a local nonprofit that ran public auctions to raise money for rehabilitation programs. They'd been struggling to draw attention to their events, and a high-profile luxury car would be a magnet for press coverage. The legal side was surprisingly easy. I had the title transferred fully into my sole name in less than an afternoon, citing marital separation and asset redistribution as the reason. No one batted an eye, especially not the clerk, who probably saw 10 messier divorce-related transfers before lunch. The next call I made was to the nonprofit director, who nearly fell over herself at the idea of receiving the car. We set the auction date for 3 weeks later, ensuring there would be time for promotional photos, press releases, and most importantly, for the local news stations to catch wind of it. Mark, of course, didn't notice the transfer. He was too busy trying to patch the holes in his business network and keep his name out of the gossip mill. I waited until the night before the scheduled pickup to act. He came home late, parking the Aston in its usual spot, tossing the keys onto the hallway table without a second thought. I took them an hour later, slipping them into my pocket as I listened to him snoring in the bedroom. The tow truck arrived at 6:15 a.m. The driver moving with the kind of quiet efficiency you only see in people who've done this 100 times. By 6:45, the driveway was empty, the only evidence of the car's existence a faint outline in the dust where its tires had sat. When Mark finally woke and wandered outside with his coffee, he froze mid-step. He stood there for a long time, the mug halfway to his lips, scanning the street as if the car might have simply rolled away overnight. Then he came back inside, his voice sharp and high, demanding to know if I'd seen anything. I looked him in the eye, my expression perfectly neutral, and told him the truth. yes, I'd seen something. I'd seen it being loaded onto a truck by the people who owned it now. The look on his face was something I'll replay for years, confusion melting into realization, and realization into a kind of stunned outrage. He didn't even bother to hide his panic when I told him where it was going. An auction? For charity? You gave away my car? It was never your car, Mark, I said evenly. It was mine, and now it's helping people who actually deserve it. The auction itself was a spectacle. The nonprofit's promotional team had done their job well: flyers, social media blasts, even a segment on the evening news showcasing the Aston under bright lights, its glossy paint gleaming like temptation itself. The winning bid came from a collector who didn't even live in the state, which meant the car was gone from Mark's reach forever. The footage of it being loaded into a transport truck played on loop in the background during the charity's televised thank you speech. I made sure Mark saw it. That night, he didn't speak to me. He didn't have to. I could feel the shift in him, the realization that his possessions were no longer safe, that the walls around him weren't walls at all but glass, and I was the one holding the stone. He sat in silence at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, and I let the moment stretch. What he didn't know was that the car was never the main goal. It was bait, a way to force his focus onto something material so he wouldn't see the next move coming. Because while he was mourning the loss of his precious Aston Martin, I was already setting in motion the collapse of something far more personal to Amelia, something she had been building toward for years, something she had wrapped her entire sense of self-worth around. And when that fell apart, it wouldn't just humiliate her, it would annihilate her. And Mark, tethered to her by their mutual guilt, would feel every ounce of it. Amelia had always been the golden child in our family, though her shine was the kind that blinded people just enough to miss the sharp edges underneath. Growing up, she wasn't satisfied with just having things; she needed to have them in front of people. Every birthday was a performance, every relationship a carefully curated exhibit, and every milestone a stage where she could bask in applause. Even when we were kids, if she got a new dress, she wouldn't wear it privately at home first. She'd wait until there was a crowd to make her grand entrance. So it wasn't surprising that her engagement had been a public spectacle from the start, complete with champagne toasts, a glossy social media announcement, and a ring she made sure caught the light in every photograph. What most people didn't know, and what I didn't know until much later, was that the man she was engaged to was blissfully unaware she was sharing her bed with my husband. When I found out about the affair between her and Mark, the betrayal cut in two directions: one for the man I had just promised my life to, and one for the sister who had been smiling in my face while carving the knife into my back. But when I learned she was engaged at the same time she was sneaking around with him, the sharpness of that blade took on a whole new dimension. This wasn't just personal, it was an opportunity. And by the time the Aston Martin had been driven out of Mark's life for good, I already had the outline of a plan that would take Amelia's carefully constructed future and set it on fire in the most public way possible. I started quietly, the way you have to when you want the truth to do the maximum damage. People imagine revenge as loud, dramatic, filled with screaming confrontations and shattered glass. But the most devastating kind happens in whispers, slow, deliberate, so that by the time the explosion comes, there's no one left standing beside the target. I began by collecting proof. Mark had been sloppy with his phone during the early days of the affair, keeping text messages and private photos buried in threads he thought I would never see. Amelia was no better. She had entire conversations archived in her email, including one particularly damning exchange where she told Mark she couldn't wait until after the wedding so we could stop sneaking around. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. I transferred everything: screenshots, photos, voice notes onto a clean USB drive, making sure the file names were nondescript enough to avoid detection until the moment I wanted them opened. Then I tracked down Amelia's fiancé. We'd only met twice, at large family gatherings where Amelia spent most of the evening steering him toward the people she wanted him to impress. He was polite in that way people are when they've been trained not to question much, and I could see in his eyes the kind of trust that assumes betrayal is something that happens to other people. I didn't contact him directly. That would have been too traceable, too easy for Amelia to spin as jealousy or misunderstanding. Instead, I used an untraceable email account, attaching the files with a short, clinical message: "For your own sake, you should know who you're marrying." No signature, no explanation, no emotional language, just the evidence and a choice. The days leading up to the wedding were excruciating in their tension. Amelia didn't suspect a thing. She posted photos of her dress fitting, videos of the venue being decorated, snapshots of the engraved champagne flutes. She was building a fairy tale, and I was watching the clock, knowing the strike of midnight was coming sooner than she thought. Mark, still reeling from losing the car, barely noticed her glowing presence. If anything, he seemed relieved to have her attention as a distraction from his own unraveling life. The morning of the wedding arrived warm and clear, the kind of weather brides dream about. The venue, a sprawling estate on the edge of town, was decked out in white roses and silk ribbons, the air humming with the sound of string quartets and the chatter of guests in designer clothes. I arrived early, keeping to the edges, watching as Amelia floated through the crowd in her gown, her smile so radiant it was almost painful to look at. She had no idea that in less than an hour, every eye in that place would be watching her for an entirely different reason. It happened just before the ceremony was meant to start. Amelia's fiancé stepped out from a side room, his face pale and set in a way that made my pulse quicken. In his hand, clutched so tightly the knuckles were white, was the USB drive. He didn't make a scene at first, he simply walked up to her in the center of the garden, handed her the drive, and said something I couldn't hear from my distance. She froze, confusion flashing across her face, and then he turned on his heel and left, not toward the altar, but toward the parking lot. What followed was chaos, the kind that ripples out in slow waves before crashing down all at once. Amelia chased after him, her heels sinking into the grass, shouting his name, but he didn't stop. Guests started whispering, heads turning, phones discreetly raised to capture the scene. And then, because cruelty often has perfect timing, someone, I don't know who, plugged that USB into the venue's presentation laptop. The projection screen that had been set up for a planned slideshow of the couple's life together flickered to life, but instead of childhood photos and vacation selfies, the first image was Amelia in bed with Mark. The room went dead silent. You could have heard the click of a camera shutter from across the lawn. And then, as the images cycled, messages, photos, timestamps, the silence broke into a collective gasp, followed by the unmistakable murmur of scandal taking root. Amelia stood frozen at the front, her bouquet trembling in her hands, her face blanching under the weight of every stare. The slideshow lasted less than 2 minutes before someone killed the feed, but by then, the damage was irreparable. I left before the shouting began. I didn't need to see her meltdown, didn't need to watch the guests scatter. I knew the story would spread on its own faster than she could possibly control. And sure enough, by the time I was halfway home, the group chats were buzzing, and a local gossip page had already posted a wedding of the year turns into cheating scandal headline. Mark called me that night, his voice tight and furious, demanding to know if I had done this. I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it either. I simply told him, you two wanted to share everything, now you can share the consequences, and then I hung up, letting the silence be my answer. But this wasn't the end. Not for Amelia, and certainly not for Mark, because while she was now the centerpiece of the city's juiciest scandal, Mark still had something left. He thought he could rely on something beyond my reach. At least, that's what he believed. But what he didn't realize was that I had already started pulling on the thread that would unravel the last of his illusions, and this time, it wouldn't just humiliate him. It would make him feel trapped, powerless, and watched from every direction. And for that, all I needed was a single call to the right federal office. The fallout from Amelia's wedding disaster lingered in the air like smoke after a building fire, thick, acrid, and impossible to ignore. For weeks, she vanished from social media entirely, which for Amelia was as good as a public confession of defeat. Mark, on the other hand, tried to operate as if nothing had happened. He avoided mentioning her name, acting like her implosion had nothing to do with him, but I could see the nervous ticks, checking his phone too often, staring at the door every time it opened in case someone came in looking for a confrontation. He still thought he could compartmentalize, to seal off the wreckage of Amelia's ruined engagement from the rest of his life. He was wrong. What Mark didn't understand was that I wasn't finished. The humiliation was only part of the punishment. The other part was removing every escape route, every safety net, until his world was as small and suffocating as mine had felt the day I walked into our bedroom and saw him with my sister. And I already knew exactly where to strike next because, months earlier, in one of his careless boasts over dinner, he'd told me about a business opportunity overseas. It wasn't legitimate, of course. Mark never invested in anything that wasn't at least half shady. He'd hinted at moving assets offshore and expanding connections, and while I didn't know the full details, I knew enough to understand one thing: he needed to travel to make it happen. And travel meant one thing: a passport. In the weeks after the wedding scandal, I quietly began pulling strings. Mark had always been loose with paperwork, leaving confidential documents in unlocked drawers or stuffed into manila folders that gathered dust. I found copies of his previous tax filings, notes about certain bank transfers, and even a scribbled list of accounts that looked suspiciously like they were under false names. It didn't take much digging to realize he had been playing a dangerous game with both his finances and the law. That gave me the weapon I needed: an anonymous tip. I crafted the message with the precision of someone threading a needle in the dark. No direct accusations, no over-the-top language, just enough verifiable detail to pique the interest of the right people. I sent it to a federal financial crimes unit, noting suspicious movement of funds overseas tied to Mark's name and addresses, along with a suggestion that he was preparing to leave the country to avoid unsettled domestic liabilities. I attached copies of the documents I'd found, clean scans, with no fingerprints of my involvement, and hit send. Then I waited. The thing about these kinds of investigations is that they don't announce themselves. There's no dramatic knock on the door or agents in dark suits marching into the living room. It starts quietly. A flag on an application here, a hold placed on a request there. In Mark's case, it began with a delay in the renewal of his passport. At first, he brushed it off, muttering about government inefficiency. But as days turned into weeks, and his business trip loomed closer, the irritation grew into something more brittle: frustration laced with a nervous edge. I watched from the kitchen as he paced with his phone, calling the passport agency, demanding answers. They told him politely but firmly that his application was under review. When he pressed for details, they refused to elaborate, citing confidentiality during active verification. His voice rose, his tone sharpened, but it made no difference. He hung up with a curse, rubbing his forehead as though that would erase the problem. A week later, he got a letter in the mail. I saw it before he did, the official government seal printed neatly on the envelope. He opened it at the table, and I caught the flicker of panic in his eyes as he read. It was short, just a few sentences informing him that his passport application had been suspended pending the outcome of an ongoing investigation into financial irregularities. There was no timeline, no reassurance, just the cold finality of bureaucratic language that made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. From that moment, I could see the walls starting to close in. His overseas contact began calling more frequently, each time with a sharper, more urgent tone. Mark tried to bluff, saying it was just a temporary delay, but even I could hear the doubt bleeding into his words. And the more he tried to keep control, the more it slipped away. His plans, whatever they were, had relied on mobility, on the ability to vanish if things got too hot. Now, he was stuck. What made it worse for him and infinitely sweeter for me was knowing that the scandal from Amelia's wedding had left him socially radioactive. The same people he might have leaned on for help were keeping their distance, unwilling to get tangled in his mess. His arrogance, once his shield, was now the reason no one wanted to stand next to him. He was isolated, and for the first time, I saw something in him I hadn't seen before: fear, not just of getting caught, but of being powerless. It was in those small moments, the way he double-locked the door at night, the way his shoulders tensed whenever an unfamiliar car slowed down in front of the house, that I knew I was winning. Because revenge isn't about a single strike. It's about dismantling someone piece by piece, until the person who once thought they were untouchable is left looking over their shoulder, waiting for the next blow. And the next blow was already lined up. Mark still had one thing left: a job that gave him enough authority and income to believe he could rebuild. He clung to it like a lifeline, telling himself that as long as he had it, he could recover from everything else. What he didn't know was that his workplace was about to learn exactly who they had sitting in their office. And once that truth came out, no amount of charm, denial, or backroom dealing would save him. Mark had always treated his job like it was a crown jewel, the one constant in a life otherwise riddled with shady dealings and fragile frauds. Even when Amelia's wedding fell apart in public, even when his passport got pulled into an investigation that left him grounded like a criminal on probation, he still clung to the belief that his position was untouchable. He liked to brag about how indispensable he was to the company, how his boss couldn't make a move without him. That arrogance wasn't just a flaw, it was the rope I planned to tighten around his neck. I had spent years quietly observing how he operated at work, and I knew the stories he never shared publicly. He liked to blur lines between personal and professional, using company resources to fund little side projects that conveniently benefited only him. I'd seen receipts for business dinners that looked suspiciously like dates with women he never mentioned to me, invoices for consulting fees sent to shell companies that were clearly his own creations. These weren't just harmless indiscretions, they were violations that, if documented and exposed, would burn through his career like wildfire. And I had the documents. When you've lived with someone long enough, you learn their patterns. Mark kept physical files for everything: contracts, expense reports, even emails he printed out because he didn't trust the cloud. He thought his habit made him secure. In reality, it made him vulnerable. One afternoon when he was out, I methodically gathered copies of everything that could be used against him. I didn't take the originals that would have tipped him off. Instead, I scanned each page, labeling them by date and category, until I had a digital dossier that was damning enough to destroy him twice over. The next step was patience. A direct attack could have been traced back to me too easily, and I wanted this to look like it came from somewhere inside his professional circle. The kind of betrayal that would make him paranoid about his colleagues. I created an anonymous email account, disguised my writing style, and drafted a carefully structured report addressed to the company's HR department and his immediate superior. It wasn't emotional, wasn't accusatory, it read like a concerned insider whistleblowing about serious ethical violations and potential legal exposure. I attached the files in neatly organized folders, each named to make the investigation effortless: misuse of funds, conflict of interest, sexual harassment claims, client fraud evidence. I didn't send it during office hours. Instead, I timed it for a Sunday evening, when the recipients would open their inboxes first thing Monday morning and have the entire day to stew in the shock before confronting him. By 9 o'clock a.m., I knew the email had done its job. Mark called me from the office, his voice tight-clipped. "They want to meet with me in the conference room," he said, trying to sound casual but failing. "Probably nothing. Just some misunderstanding." It wasn't nothing. He didn't come home at his usual time that day. When he finally walked through the door after dark, his expression was a mix of anger and disbelief, the look of someone who'd been blindsided but didn't want to admit how much damage had been done. He poured himself a drink without a word, then muttered something about jealous coworkers and witch hunts. I stayed silent, watching the cracks spread across his composure. Over the next week, I saw him unravel in real time. There were more meetings at odd hours, hushed phone calls in the driveway, and stacks of paperwork he brought home that he refused to leave out of sight. He was no longer in control of the narrative. He was reacting, scrambling, trying to plug leaks in a ship that was already halfway sunk. His boss stopped speaking to him directly, sending messages through intermediaries instead. Clients began canceling or postponing deals, citing sudden concerns. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and I knew the final strike was coming. It came on a Thursday morning. Mark left for work as usual, dressed sharper than I'd seen him in weeks, as if trying to remind everyone he was still important. But by noon, he was back, this time carrying a cardboard box filled with the contents of his desk. His face was pale, his jaw locked so tight I could see the muscle twitch. He didn't say a word to me as he set the box down in the corner and went straight to the bedroom. Later, I overheard him on the phone, telling someone, probably Amelia, that he'd been forced out but that it was temporary. He insisted he'd bounce back soon, that he still had other plans in motion, but I could hear the hollowness in his tone. His job wasn't just a paycheck. It was his last foothold of credibility, the one thing he could point to when people questioned his worth. And now it was gone. The best part? I didn't need to see him hand over his badge or watch security escort him out. The real satisfaction came from knowing he had no idea who had set the dominoes in motion. He would suspect everyone: his colleagues, his clients, maybe even Amelia, but not me. And that meant he'd spend the coming weeks looking in all the wrong places while I prepared the next move. Because there was still one prize he had been clinging to through all of this: the house he and Amelia had been trying to buy together. They thought it would be their fresh start, a place to build a life far away from the mess they'd made here. And I intended to make sure that fresh start never happened. And this time, I wasn't just going to take it from them quietly. I was going to make sure they saw exactly whose name was on the deed. The house was their light at the end of the tunnel, or at least, that's what they thought. Mark and Amelia believed they were just a few weeks away from a new chapter. The words Amelia had gushed about on her Instagram, all accompanied by filtered photos of sunsets and coffee mugs with cheesy quotes. They thought they were buying their freedom in bricks and drywall, a place untouched by the wreckage I'd been methodically leaving in their path. But I knew something they didn't. Their dream home wasn't locked down yet. It wasn't theirs, not legally, not financially, and that meant it could be mine. Mark had been bragging about the house since before the wedding. He loved to talk about the gated community, the modern open concept, and how people like us deserve to live in a place that screams success. Amelia would chime in with her own fantasies: white kitchen cabinets, a backyard for future kids, wine nights on the deck. They had toured the property 3 times, taken videos, sent floor plans to friends. They were emotionally moved, and before the ink was even dry on the contract. That was their mistake. After Mark lost his job, their financing became delicate. They didn't know I'd already looked into it, but I had. Without his income, the mortgage approval wasn't guaranteed. Amelia had some savings, but nothing close to what they needed for the down payment. They were in the middle of scrambling for a co-signer, her Plan B uncle from out of state, when I decided to intervene. I still had access to the realtor through a number Mark had once used to send me smug property listings. It took one carefully crafted phone call to confirm that the deal wasn't finalized. The seller had other interested parties, but the realtor was holding off out of professional courtesy to Mark and Amelia. I knew then that I could end this before it began. I didn't just match their offer, I surpassed it. I walked into the realtor's office with a certified check that covered the full asking price in cash, courtesy of the account I'd built from draining the joint funds and strategically liquidating assets he never thought I'd touch. My offer was clean: no contingencies, no financing delays, no co-signers. The seller accepted on the spot. The best part was that the process was so swift that Mark and Amelia didn't even know the house was off the market until it was too late. One Thursday morning, Amelia posted a story about final walkthrough day, complete with a boomerang of champagne glasses clinking. By Friday afternoon, the realtor was calling to regretfully inform them that the property had been sold to someone else. She wouldn't tell them who, of course, privacy and all that, but I wanted them to find out. The day I got the keys, I drove straight there. It was everything they had described and more. The sunlight hit the living room in the exact angle Amelia once said would be perfect for Christmas morning photos. The kitchen smelled faintly of fresh paint, and the backyard was big enough for all the future kids they'd never have together. I didn't move in. This wasn't about living there, it was about owning the thing they'd built their fantasy around. I had a crew come in the next week to install a tall black iron fence around the entire perimeter. On the gate, I hung a large white sign in crisp black lettering: private property, no trespassing. I placed it where anyone driving up the cul-de-sac would see it before they even reached the driveway. 2 days later, I got exactly what I wanted. Mark's car pulled up to the gate. From my spot inside, I watched them sit there for a few moments, confused, before Amelia got out and approached the fence. She looked at the lock, the sign, the security cameras mounted above the corners. Her phone came out of her pocket, and I saw her dial probably the realtor. She gestured wildly toward the house, her voice rising even though I couldn't hear her from where I stood. Mark stayed in the car, jaw tight, avoiding eye contact with anyone. I waited until they started to leave before I made my move. I walked out onto the front porch, coffee mug in hand, wearing the same calm smile I'd given them the day they thought they'd broken me. Amelia froze when she saw me. Her voice cracked when she asked, "What are you doing here?" I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. Enjoying my new home. It was silent for a moment, one of those silences that hangs heavy, like the air right before a storm. Then Amelia's face crumpled, the reality hitting her in waves. Mark didn't even get out of the car. He just started it again and pulled away without a word, leaving her scrambling to catch up. I didn't watch them drive off completely. I'd already turned and gone back inside. My point made. They'd lost more than a property that day. They'd lost the illusion that they were still building a future together. Everything they touched was mine to take or destroy, and they knew it now. But I wasn't finished. There was still one final move, something that wouldn't just strip away what they had, but redefine how the entire world saw me and by extension them. It was time to step into the light, not as a victim, but as the architect of my own survival. That meant going public, and I knew exactly how I was going to do it. When I say I wasn't done, I mean it in the truest sense. Every cut I had delivered to Mark and Amelia up until this point had been deliberate, precise, and kept within the confines of their personal and professional world. They were bleeding out in silence, forced to watch as everything they'd once used to define themselves slipped from their fingers. But this final move, the one I'd been holding back, wasn't meant to just end them. It was meant to immortalize me. It started with a message from a journalist I vaguely knew through mutual friends. She ran a digital magazine focused on resilience, women's stories, survival after betrayal, and reclaiming one's life. She had seen hints of what I'd been doing without me ever broadcasting it, subtle ripples that made their way through the right circles. She didn't know the names, and I wasn't about to hand them over, but she knew there was a bigger story here. Her pitch was simple. You've been through hell and came out the other side standing taller. I want to tell that story. For a few days, I debated whether it was worth it. Going public, even without mentioning them by name, meant putting myself in a spotlight that couldn't be turned off. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was the perfect closing move. Not a scream, not a rant, not a victim's desperate plea for pity. A calm, collected narrative where I dictated every detail, not to bury them in scandal directly, but to force them to live with the knowledge that anyone who knew them would connect the dots. We met for the interview at a quiet rooftop cafe. I wore a crisp white blouse and tailored black pants, professional, timeless, the kind of look that doesn't shout for attention but commands it anyway. The skyline stretched behind me as the recorder clicked on. I told my story in a way that left space for the reader to fill in their own faces for the villains. I spoke about trust broken in the most intimate way possible, about betrayal not just of a spouse but of family, and how I had chosen to respond not with chaos, but with strategy. I framed it as a blueprint for reclaiming your life when someone tries to take it from you. I didn't tell them about the iron fence, the drained accounts, or the wrecked business deals in those exact words. Instead, I called them actions to reclaim what was mine and steps to protect my future. The journalist was careful, asking questions that allowed me to paint a picture without giving her the exact colors. But I knew, and she knew, that the beauty of the piece would be in its subtext. Anyone who had watched Mark and Amelia's lives unravel over the past months would see the parallels instantly. When the article went live, it was accompanied by a full-page photo of me. I was sitting at a sleek desk, sunlight cutting across my face, wearing that same calm smile I had given Amelia through the iron gate. The headline read, "I didn't scream, I rebuilt." The reaction was immediate. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years sent messages saying they were proud of me, calling me an inspiration. Strangers left comments on the magazine's page about how they saw themselves in my words, how they wished they had chosen silence over self-destruction in their own betrayals. And then came the whispers. In our hometown, in the industry where Mark had once tried to make a name for himself, in the extended family groups where Amelia still lingered, people connected the dots. They didn't need confirmation. The timing, the hints, the way certain phrases mirrored real events. It was enough. They began to see them not as a couple who had faced bad luck, but as the architects of their own collapse. Mark stopped showing up at the few professional networking events he was still invited to. Amelia's social media went from daily posts about gratitude and new beginnings to complete silence. I heard from a friend that she'd even deactivated her accounts after a series of thinly veiled comments on her last post, all referencing that article. But the real victory wasn't in their absence, it was in my presence. Invitations started arriving. Speaking engagements for women's business groups, panels about overcoming adversity, even a podcast interview that reached a national audience. I never needed to name them. I never needed to say what they did. My life now stood as the living proof of what happens when you take your pain and forge it into something unbreakable. In one of those talks, I remember standing on stage, looking out at a room full of people, and realizing something profound. The most devastating day of my life, the day I stood in that doorway and saw the man I married with my sister, had become the foundation for something far greater than I ever could have built without it. Mark and Amelia wanted to define me by that moment. They wanted me to be the woman who broke, who screamed, who made a scene and was forgotten. Instead, I became the woman who rebuilt so quietly and so thoroughly that by the time they realized what I was doing, there was nothing left for them to salvage. And the best part? My name was no longer tied to theirs. It was tied to survival, strategy, and strength. The last time I saw them purely by chance was at a grocery store. Mark looked older, the kind of aging that comes from stress rather than time. Amelia avoided my eyes completely. I smiled, offered a polite nod, and walked past without saying a word. Because I didn't need to. They knew. And that's the thing about true revenge, it's not about the final blow. It's about building a life so far above the wreckage they created that they have to crane their necks just to see you. And even then, they'll never quite reach. I walked out of that store, sunlight warm on my face, knowing that every step I had taken was deliberate, every move part of a bigger picture they never saw coming. I didn't scream, I rebuilt, and in doing so, I erased them not from memory, but from relevance.